Hey everyone, Brian here. Welcome back to Minecraft. So, the purpose of this series, I just want to reiterate. So, the purpose of this series is to use Minecraft as a platform to talk about game design, and I still intend for that to be the main purpose of this series. But at the end of the last episode, when I was talking about cheating versus hacking and how that relates to Minecraft creative mode and all that good stuff, I made a comment about how if your game is not interactive, you may as well be making a movie. And I still believe that. Like, I believe that is basically true. But it got me thinking about video games and interactivity and movies, and I started asking myself about video game movies, because this is a topic that lots of people have a hard time with. Why do video game movies suck? And when asking myself this question, I thought, well, do they really suck? Do video game movies inherently make bad movies? That's not really how I want to put it. More accurately, it's really difficult to put into words. Or at least it's difficult for me to put into words. I guess what I'm really trying to say is, does the story of a video game make for a bad movie? And, you know, lots of people would say yes. Lots of people would say you can't make a video game into a movie because video games are inherently an interactive media. And when you try to turn an interactive media into a non-interactive media, that is, turning a video game into a movie, you're going to fail. Because what makes a video game so good is the fact that it's interactive. And I'm going to risk making an extremely unpopular statement and say, well, what about Assassin's Creed? Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, Brian, Assassin's Creed is really bad. It got panned by the critics. I mean, yes, that's true. It got, for instance, 17% on Rotten Tomatoes and 36% on Metacritic, which people will say, you know, hey, doesn't that make this objectively a bad movie? My answer to that is no, it doesn't. It doesn't make it objectively a bad movie. What it means is that critics didn't like it. But let's look at it objectively for a moment. Is the Assassin's Creed movie really any worse than any big budget action movie? Because my opinion is no. I actually really liked the Assassin's Creed movie. And again, at the risk of making extremely unpopular statements, I'm actually going to spend this episode of Minecraft comparing the Assassin's Creed movie to two movies that are subjectively more popular. And those two movies that I'm going to compare it to are X-Men First Class and X-Men Days of Futures Past. Now, is this going to be critical suicide? Possibly. For instance, when we compare, so I mentioned that the Assassin's Creed movie got 17% on Rotten Tomatoes and 36% on Metacritic. Objectively bad scores. Now, compare that to X-Men First Class, which got 86% on Rotten Tomatoes and 65% on Metacritic, and then Days of Futures Past got 91% on Rotten Tomatoes and 74% on Metacritic. So, objectively, both movies got better scores. And we say, well, objectively, doesn't that make them better movies? But let's think about it for a moment, because the truth of the matter is that these two X-Men movies, when you stand back and stop looking at them as adaptations from other media and start looking at them as movies, are they any more or less ridiculous than Assassin's Creed? I mean, they all had similar budgets. Assassin's Creed cost $125 million to make. X-Men First Class was somewhere between 140 and 160 million. And Days of Futures Past had a budget of $200 million. So they're all in the same, general ballpark. They all starred Michael Fassbender, who's a great actor, by the way. I really like him in a lot of different things, including all three of these movies. I'm not trying to say that I dislike X-Men, First Class or X-Men Days of Futures Past. I love both of those movies just as much as I love Assassin's Creed. But when it really comes down to it, Assassin's Creed is over the top. The action sequences are, overproduced, and, there's a lot of CGI, and this, that, and the other thing, but, X-Men First Class and X-Men Days of Futures Past have the same issues, if issues are what you want to call them. I don't particularly think that they're problems, but lots of people panned Assassin's Creed while praising both X-Men movies. But it's really hard to talk about these things because, again, I'm not an expert on movies. I'm not an expert on. I mean, I like to think that I know a lot about video games because I play a lot of video games. But does that necessarily make me an expert? The answer is no. But so video games are funny because they are, in the end, an interactive media. That is, we enjoy video games because we are able to interact with them. And movies, on the other hand, are non-interactive. We don't interact with them. We watch them. We are told a story by the filmmakers. The filmmakers are telling a story. And in my opinion, video game movies get unfairly judged by their entire audience. If you're a fan of the video game, you are unfairly judging the movie because you're intentionally or unintentionally going into the movie with the expectation that it's going to be a faithful adaptation of this video game that you're a fan of. And from the other side, if you're a movie buff, the movie tends to fall apart because you don't necessarily know anything about the video game it's based on. And that, in my opinion, is a failing of the filmmaker, because you cannot make a film with the expectation that your entire audience is going to know anything about whatever media it's adapted from. So, to compare that again to the X-Men First Class, X-Men Days of Futures Past, if the filmmakers had gone into those films, had gone into making those films with the expectation that every single person watching those films would know anything about the characters in those films would have failed. Because you can't. Lots of people's first exposure to the X-Men universe would have been through those films. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's not what I'm trying to comment on. The fact of the matter is that lots of people were first exposed to the X-Men universe through X-Men First Class or X-Men Days of Futures Past. That's just how it is. And the same can be said of video game movies. If your very first exposure to the Assassin's Creed universe came through the Assassin's Creed movie, then requiring the audience to know something about the Assassin's Creed universe prior to seeing the movie would be a mistake. In my opinion, though, Assassin's Creed is a great movie, all on its own. Just great movie, period. Don't qualify that with, oh, it's a good movie, but it's a bad video game movie. No, that's stupid. We have to stop thinking that way. Because when you're making a movie, here's how it has to go. We have this story. How do we tell this story through the media of film? Because you can't go in and say, well, let's make this movie for the gamers, which means that, you know, every person who sees this movie has to know something about the games. That doesn't work. That will fail every single time. Because not everyone seeing your movie is necessarily going to know anything about the video games. And expecting them to is a mistake of the highest order. Because you're going to piss off the gamers, who are already going to be pissed off no matter what, because no matter how good your movie is, it is never, ever, ever going to be interactive in the way that video games are. And you're going to leave the rest of your audience confused, because they're going to be like, what the hell is going on? I don't understand. Because you've required a pre-knowledge of this video game universe that your standard movie-going public just isn't going to have. Now, does that mean that you can't create little nods to the gaming community? No, of course you can. You can include characters from video games. For instance, let's talk for just a second. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time dwelling on it, but just for a second, the Resident Evil franchise, the Resident Evil movie franchise. which has done exceptionally well for itself. I mean, they keep making movies. They continue to be, I don't know if they're, like, I haven't actually done the research, but if they weren't box office successes, they wouldn't keep making more movies. So obviously they're doing something right. So what are they doing right? Well, they bring in characters from the video games. Jill Valentine is in them, Albert Wesker, Chris and Claire Redfield. They bring those characters in to the movies, but at the same time, you don't have to have played any of the games to get enjoyment out of those movies. And in my opinion, the same is true for Assassin's Creed. You don't have to have played any of the Assassin's Creed games to get enjoyment out of Assassin's Creed as a movie. And when we compare Assassin's Creed as a movie to X-Men First Class and X-Men Days of Futures Past, you know, they do a lot of the same things right. You don't have to have read any of the X-Men comic books to get enjoyment out of those movies. They have all of the same characters, and those characters are more or less the same in the movies as they are in the comic books, but they explore different storylines. Because when you are making a movie, you have to tell the story differently than if you were making a video game. When you're making a video game, you don't necessarily start with a fully fleshed out story. You start your video game with a mechanic, or with a character, or with some high-level concept that wouldn't necessarily work in any other media. Oh, I'm gonna go back inside. Oof, that was close. But you don't necessarily start making your video game with a fully fleshed out story in mind. Your story will develop as you make your game. And Assassin's Creed, in my opinion, has one of the deepest, most complex, richest stories in video gaming. It's detailed and highly nuanced, and there's a lot going on. But they don't tell that story in the same way that you would tell a story if you were making a movie. Because video games are interactive. So when you are telling a story in a video game, you don't want to just dump a whole lot of exposition on your player all at once. It's actually one of the cardinal mistakes that video games sometimes make. You know, you open up with this massive cutscene, and it has a really high production value, and it's like 20 minutes long, and you tell your players all of this story information, but in the end that fails, because it takes 20 minutes for your player to get into the game, and they're sitting there and they're watching this big massive cutscene, and they're just like, God damn it, I just want to play the game already. Just let me play the game. And as great as that story is, whatever that story is doesn't matter. because you've already disconnected your player from the game. Now you've forced them to watch a movie, and that's not why they're playing the game. They're not playing the game to watch a movie. They're playing the game to play a game. And if you don't let your players get in and play the game immediately, they're going to lose interest. Whereas, if you're making a movie, you can do that. You can go and you can give a whole lot of exposition right at the beginning, but, I mean, obviously, it's better if you know, the whole idea of show don't tell is always better. I mean, I feel like there were mistakes made in the very beginning of the Assassin's Creed movie, because the Assassin's Creed movie opens with a text scroll where text comes up on the screen, and I don't like text scrolls at the beginning of movies. Even, again, possible unpopular comment, even like at the beginning of Star Wars, for instance. A text scroll at the beginning of a movie means that there's information I need before I can start enjoying the movie. And a cutscene at the beginning of the game is kind of the same thing. It means, hey, you can't play the game yet because there's information I have to give you first. You need this information before you can enjoy the game. If you don't have this information, you're not going to enjoy the game. And that breaks the immersion. It breaks the engagement in the game. And that brings us back to interactivity in video games, because there's a whole era of video games that didn't have cutscenes, that didn't have any kind of narrative. Let's look back at, the original Legend of Zelda, for the NES. I mean, yes, there was story, and if you sit on the title screen of the original Legend of Zelda for the NES, eventually you'll get that same kind of a text roll that will give you the background story of the game. And then, of course, at the end of the game, there will be another text roll explaining to you the conclusion and everything else. But the game itself can be played and enjoyed without that information. You can just jump right in, have a great time without that information. And the same needs to be true of any game. The same needs to be true of any movie. I shouldn't need all kinds of pre-knowledge before being able to enjoy this movie or this game. And X-Men First Class does a great job. Yes, it uses characters from the X-Men universe, and it uses them quite well. Again, Days of Futures Past does the same thing. Do you need to have seen First Class in order to appreciate Days of Futures Past? Maybe. I don't know. You might enjoy it more if you've seen it, but I don't think you need to have seen the other movie, because they do, each kind of stand on their own. They have their own storylines. They have their own arcs. So do you need to have seen one in order to appreciate the other? I don't think so. But that's not what I'm really, focused on here that's not really my point. My point is that in order to enjoy the Assassin's Creed movie, I don't need to have played any of the games. I have played all of the games. So when the Assassin's Creed movie makes reference to things like Abstergo and, various people who were involved, they talk about, the Pieces of Eden, there's the Assassin's Order, there's the Templars, things like that. I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, I remember that from the games. That's cool that they're making reference to those things. But they don't require me. The movie didn't require me to know about those things before being able to enjoy the movie. So what we need to do in order to have good video game movies is we have to stop thinking about them as video game movies and just start thinking about them as movies. Right? It's the same kind of thing as comic book movies. Can you enjoy a comic book movie? Can you enjoy X-Men Days of Futures Past? Can you enjoy X-Men First Class? Can you enjoy any of the Avengers movies? Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, they all have their own movies. Can you enjoy those movies without having any pre-knowledge of the characters? And the answer is yes. Countless people throughout the world have never touched a comic book in their lives. And yet, the Avengers, Iron Man, Captain America, these movies continue to succeed. They continue to be popular with people who have never touched a comic book in their lives. Because they don't require you to know anything about the characters. They don't require you to know anything about the universes before you enjoy the movie. And video games, if they are going to have successful movies, need to take the same approach. They need to stop thinking about it as a video game movie and just start thinking about it as a movie. So we have this concept, we have this story. How do we tell that story through this media of film? And the first thing you have to throw out the window, exactly like comic book movies did, you have to throw out the idea that people need to know about it in advance. And it's funny because another one of my favorite video game movies, and I don't know how other people feel about this one, but the Street Fighter movie. The Street Fighter movie from the mid-90s, absolutely terrible film. And yet I enjoy it. Why do I enjoy it? Because it's so terrible. It is a really bad movie. And it is a bad adaptation of the Street Fighter games. But it's hilarious. Like, it is just so bad that it's good. But in order to enjoy it, I need that pre-knowledge of the Street Fighter universe. I need to recognize the characters. I need to recognize, okay, Guile's a character from the game. Chun-Li is a character from the game. M. Bison is a character from the game. Sagat is a character from the game. and so on, and so on, and so on. And I need that pre-knowledge in order to enjoy the Street Fighter movie. Not so with Assassin's Creed. I could watch Assassin's Creed having never played the Assassin's Creed games. I have played the Assassin's Creed games, which added to my enjoyment because I was able to see the references that they were making and say, oh yeah, I remember that from the games. That's cool that they included that. But it's not necessary. And that's why I think that Assassin's Creed is actually good. Yes, it got panned by the critics, but maybe it shouldn't have, you know? Maybe if we could get away from this idea that a good video game movie has to be a faithful adaptation of the video game. Maybe if we could get away from that, we would have better luck making good video game movies. And here's the challenge I'd like to send out to gamers, right? Here's the challenge I'd like to send out to gamers. Watch the Assassin's Creed movie and try to think about it. If I had never played Assassin's Creed, would I enjoy this movie? Think about it. I mean, seriously think about how it would stack up as a movie if you had never played Assassin's Creed. Because I think it's a good movie. I really do. I think that it has a lot of good points. I feel like the acting is good. I feel like the writing is good. The direction is good. Obviously, the visual effects are amazing. Yeah, there's a lot of CGI, but you know, there's no more CGI in Assassin's Creed than there is in X-Men First Class or X-Men Days of Futures Past. Those have just as much CGI, possibly more. They have more characters in them that required CGI for sure. They had more scenes that required CGI. I mean, in Days of Futures Past, Magneto lifts a football stadium. For Christ's sake. Nobody's doing that in Assassin's Creed, let me tell you that much. And yet, Assassin's Creed was critically panned, while Days of Futures Past was critically acclaimed. 91% on Rotten Tomatoes versus 17%. Why? I mean, Assassin's Creed is no more ridiculous a concept than X-Men Days of Futures Past. In fact, and this is something that's only just occurred to me, right? This is something that's only just occurred to me. Days of Futures Past is about, like, at its core, Wolverine is sending his mind back in time to his earlier self in order to avoid a bad future. I mean, if that's not a ridiculous concept, then I don't know what is. But compare that to what's happening in Assassin's Creed. Because in Assassin's Creed, the main character is being placed in the Animus, this piece of technology that sends his mind back through his genetic memory to the memories of his ancestor, so that he can experience that ancestor's memories and find this piece of Eden. it's the parallel is shocking. The parallel between these two stories is shocking, and yet one does really well and one does really poorly. And why? I don't understand. Why is one concept so good and the other concept so bad? At least as far as the critics are concerned, because I personally enjoy both. If you guys have your own opinions about video game movies and why they're so bad and what could be done to make them better, absolutely leave comments below. I'm prepared. I'm prepared to take the hate on this because I understand that lots of people have very, very strong opinions about video game movies and movies in general and video games in general. I don't think that we should limit video game movies to needing to be faithful adaptations of video games. There are some great stories out there in video games, but what we need to do is stop thinking about them as video games and start thinking about them as stories that could be told through a different media. I would love to see more stories taken from video games and say, how could we tell this story through film? Because if we can approach video game movies in that way, I think we'd have some great, great films out there that would be enjoyed by gamers and non-gamers alike. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please feel free to do so. Check out my Patreon page, and as always, we'll see you again next time.